Hello and welcome. I'm Somesh. If we look at Nepali politics post Jana Andolan 2, one thing that makes headlines every now and then is the mention of foreign interference by the parties when they are not on upswing. Mostly they're talking about India and sometimes about China. Wedged between the two nuclear powers and fast-growing economies, it probably is impossible for Nepal not to be influenced. But the worrying sign, as analysts say, is that Nepal has often played pawn at the hands of its huge neighbors. To talk more about Nepal's relations with its neighbors and how we could manage that, we have Ashok Gurung in our studio. Ashok Gurung is the director of the Indo-China Institute at the New School in New York City. He has over 15 years of international development experience as an educator, researcher, manager, grant maker, policy analyst, activist, and training facilitator with civil society groups, academic institutions, foundations, and multilateral organizations, and governments in over 40 countries worldwide. He has taught at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and he served as program officer for the Ford Foundation International Fellowships Program, which is the largest global leadership initiative. Mr. Guru, welcome to our studio. Mr. Guru,
thank you for inviting me.
Would we say that suddenly we've become very important for our neighbors?
I think it would be fair to say that now the two neighbors are paying closer attention to Nepal for its both past relationships as well as its emerging role, because of its location and also because of its potential.
So you're trying to say that we really have potential to influence the two huge economies?
What I meant by potential is that Nepal in the future is going to matter to both India and China, as well as international community, mainly because we occupy a very important space in the Himalayas. And Himalayas, as most people around the world know, in many ways serves, as people have often used the term, water tower, or from larger environmental perspective, issues of climate change. I think Nepal becomes very important. But also Nepal becomes very important because of its strategic location, historically as well as now.
The buffer state that we are between
That's
India
right.
and China.
Is really the emerging notion of Nepal being seen by a few as more of a land-linked country, which I think is good for not only Nepal, but also good for a large number of people in China and large number of people in eastern part of India.
So we've always, traditionally, we've been thinking that we're a landlocked country, but now the situation post-1990 has changed. Now we have two fastest growing economies on both sides. So now even people have started saying that we are a real valuable piece of real estate. Is it that very reason that makes India and China now compete with each other to have some kind of control over Nepal or influence over Nepal?
I think I would look at this very important question in two ways. One is what Nepal ought to do, and one is how India and China may also rethink their understanding of looking at Nepal and engagement with Nepal. On the Nepali side, I think it's high time that the idea of Nepal in relation to India, China, I think needs to move towards this notion that I referred to in my earlier comment as land-linked, a connecting space. In the past, especially during the royal regime, the idea of Nepal being yam between two rocks perhaps worked to some degree, given the particular...
We're talking about 100 years ago.
Yes, even up until, let's say, in 80s, during Panchayat era. Some might argue that it worked, that Nepal being yam between two rocks. And then in recent years, some politicians have referred to Nepal as dynamite between two rocks. And I find both these images and these ideas problematic. the idea of yam between two rocks, I think in some ways evokes this idea that Nepal is somewhat helpless.
Exactly.
Somewhat, you're at the mercy of the two neighbors.
That makes us feel small.
That's right, small. So it really creates a national psyche, which I think, as we all know, Nepal is the 40th largest country in the world.
In terms of population.
In terms of population, and also I think in the future, in terms of potential, it could be huge. So I think the idea of landlocked and yam between two rocks, I think is not a helpful way to look at the future. Similarly, the idea of Nepal being dynamite between two rocks is also very counterproductive, in fact dangerous.
We look at ourselves as something that would spark disaster.
Exactly, and I think A, it's not viable, B, it's not a right way to think, because I think a large number of people will quickly tell you that that kind of strategy, is, even from a political point of view, not a smart strategy. So I think the emphasis has to be in an increasingly globalized world where all kinds of issues, from traditional security issues to non-traditional security issues, depend a great deal, and if it is managed well, and if it is carefully orchestrated, that it actually, the idea of linked, the connecting space, whether it's during the heydays of Nepali business community trading with Tibet, or trading with the South, that is India, I think that idea needs to be taken to a higher level.
So that also, you just mentioned security. Is both India and China show their insecurity from security point of view? They have that security fears. When it comes to Nepal, China always thinks that due to porous border, any anti-China activity can be brought in Nepal. Similarly, India has its own problems, thinking about the same porous border, when anything that any terrorist could come to Nepal is what they say, and it's come. They've been repeating it too many times these days. So do you think these insecurity fears that they have are really have a real ground, or is it more of a hype?
I think it is understandable that both the countries will look at Nepal in a careful manner when it comes to protecting their security interest. For India, I think Nepalis have to realize, and many Nepalis do, is because of the porous border, because of mobility issues, one cannot simply dismiss India's concerns vis-a-vis, not just China, but others. The whole,
Exactly.
Hijacking of the airline, a few years back.
We were 11 years back.
11 years back. Thank you for pointing that out. And also, issues related to China. And especially, I think, if you look at China, it is clear globally. It's no secret whether when it comes to India or whether it's come to the U.S. China is particularly sensitive to Tibetan issue. Since
and somehow
both Nepal and India, right?
We've been. China was embarrassed just on the eve of Olympics, and then one of the major protests that took place was in Kathmandu.
That's right. So I think, in that sense, Nepal, more so than any other country in the world, I think it is in a very tight space, when it comes to dealing with and managing a relationship with China vis-a-vis Tibetan issue. Look at how the Indian government, for all its strength, all its size, which is much bigger than Nepal, when it comes to Tibetan issue, India too has to be extremely sensitive. So Nepal, in that respect,
But having said that, Nepali government for a long time, and even now they've been reiterating that Nepal will not let its territory be used against anti-China activities or even anti-India activities. We've shown our commitment multiple times, but how come India and China still have that fear?
Well, I think it's true that Nepal has repeatedly stated that
we believe in one China policy.
One China policy. However, whenever demonstrations take place, whenever Indian side views, rightly or wrongly, that there is increased activities by Chinese side in Nepal, that they take it to level where it becomes a major issue between the two countries. Here I would also say this. One is what happens in Nepal vis-a-vis Indian and Chinese security interest. But the second thing one has to remember, that India and China share a huge border between the two. And it's one of the borders in the world that is still unresolved. The border dispute still continues. And in fact, it is one of the major issues that still, in the recent years, not historically, but recent years, India-China relationship at one level is still stuck in the era that resulted after 1962
despite a lot of friendly gestures from both sides.
That's right. So I think in that sense, my thinking is both for Nepalis as well as for Chinese, both for Nepalis as well as Indians. I think if since we live in this universe, especially the global system of nation state, I think the idea of respecting each other's sovereignty and any perception or misperception of encroachment, I think governments will raise these issues. So
yeah,
how do you manage that?
That's true. That's true. But let's also look at it from this point of view. Security concerns are shown by both the sides. At some point, maybe it has good foundation as well.
That's right.
But on the pretext of that, we've seen a lot of Chinese envoys, some high-level delegates, as well as Indian high-level delegates. Hardly a couple of months pass by when we don't have delegates from either of the countries. Is it not a sign of growing interference? Aren't we showing ourselves as meek, as you said, yam between two rocks?
I think it's clearly a problem. Whether they are founded on a real a set of issues or not, I think it's true. And again, there are two ways to look at it. One is, I think when these activities, especially at high level, begins to really interfere with the internal political process. And today there is an excellent op-ed piece by Siddharth Vardarajan, who writes for Hindu. And recently, Prasad Jha, as many Nepalis know, wrote an excellent piece on, again, looking at Nepal-India relations. And based on these reports, I don't watch these things that carefully because I'm based in New York. I think it's clear that intellectuals, leaders, and people on the street, they tend to believe that in recent years, India's interference, especially the perception of micromanaging, is a real problem. It, in many ways, goes beyond this usual protocol, between the two countries. So I think that's the worrisome situation. I would say that is definitely not good for Nepal, and also it's not good for India. India that is aspiring to be a major global player. For them to really micromanage and leave the process by and large to bureaucrats, I think is unfortunate. On the Chinese side, compared to the Indian level of engagement, I think one can still say that it's rather small.